In the frozen silence of a frontier dawn, where survival meant grit and mercy was rare, a tiny girl in a tattered dress stood before a mountain of a man, and whispered words that shattered his world. "They want to hurt my mom, she is sick." And in that moment, the giant rancher didn't just hear a plea, he heard a call to war. The frost clung to every blade of grass like shattered glass as the sun cracked open the sky, painting the pines in amber and violet. A little girl, no older than 6, her cheeks flushed pink from cold, her bare feet wrapped in frayed burlap tied with twine, stood frozen on the porch of a weathered log cabin, her eyes white as river stones, fixed on the towering figure blocking the doorway. He was a man carved from granite and storm, 6'7", shoulders broad enough to carry a steer, chest thick with muscle earned not in gyms but in fields and fights, skin bronzed by sun and wind, hair dark as wet earth falling past his jaw. His name was Silas, Bearclaw, Rourke, owner of the Blackridge Ranch, a land so vast it swallowed horizons, a man feared for his temper, respected for his justice, and whispered about for the way he'd once wrestled a grizzly barehanded to save a child. He wore no shirt, just dirt-stained denim trousers held by a leather belt, boots caked with mud, and a rifle slung over his shoulder like an afterthought. Behind him, the cabin's door stood ajar, revealing a dim interior lit by a single oil lamp, the scent of pine resin and dried herbs drifting out like a ghost. The girl didn't flinch, didn't cry, just stared up at him, her small hands trembling at her sides, her breath puffing white in the air. "They're coming," she whispered, voice thin as a thread but steady as stone. "To take Mama. She can't walk. She can't fight. They say she's weak. That she don't belong here anymore." Silas didn't move, didn't speak, just lowered his gaze slowly, letting his eyes trace the tears streaking down her face, the chipped paint on her orange dress, the way her fingers curled into fists like she was trying to hold herself together. He'd seen hunger, seen fear, seen death, but this was different. This was innocence standing alone against the dark. And for the first time in years, the giant rancher felt something crack inside him, not anger, not rage, but something far more dangerous, responsibility. He knelt, not to comfort, but to meet her eye level. "Who's coming?" he asked, voice gravel and thunder. She swallowed hard. "The men from town. The ones who own the bank. They say Mama owes money, but she's sick. Real sick. Coughing blood. Can't get out of bed." Silas's jaw tightened. He knew those men, knew their greed, knew how they used debt as a weapon, how they took homes, land, lives, especially from women left alone. And now they were coming for a sick woman, and her child. He rose slowly, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Where's your mama?" he asked. She pointed a shaky finger toward the tree line. 2 miles east, in the old Miller shack. "It's falling apart, but it's all we got." Silas didn't hesitate. He turned, grabbed his coat from the hook inside, and pulled it on. Then he looked back at her. "Get on my back," he said. "We're going to find your mama, and then we're going to make sure no one ever comes near you again." The ride to the Miller shack was silent except for the crunch of hooves on frost and the occasional whimper from the girl clinging to Silas's broad back. Her name was Maeve O'Donnell, though she hadn't spoken it since the fever took her mother's memory last winter. She buried her face in the rough wool of Silas's coat, breathing in the scent of wood smoke, sweat, and something deeper, something wild, untamed, like the mountains themselves. He rode without speaking, his massive hands gripping the reins with quiet precision, his eyes scanning the horizon like a hawk. Every rustle in the brush, every creak of a branch, made him tense, but never slow. He wasn't afraid. He was calculating, planning, because he knew what was coming. The men from town weren't just coming to collect a debt. They were coming to erase a problem. To take a woman too weak to resist, a child too small to fight, and leave them in the snow like forgotten scraps. When they reached the shack, a crumbling structure barely holding itself upright, its roof sagging under the weight of neglect, Silas dismounted first, lifting Maeve down gently before striding to the door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sickness, damp wool, stale broth, and the metallic tang of blood. A woman lay on a pallet near the hearth, her face pale as chalk, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her hair, once fiery red like her daughter's, was tangled and dull, her hands shaking as she tried to pull a blanket tighter around her. She didn't look up when Silas entered. Didn't react when he knelt beside her. Only when he placed a calloused hand on her forehead did she stir. "You're not one of them," she murmured, voice barely audible. "No," Silas replied, his voice softer than Maeve had ever heard it. "I'm the one who's gonna make sure they never touch you again." Maeve rushed to her mother's side, clutching her hand. "He's gonna help us, Mama," she whispered. "He's big. Bigger than anyone. And he doesn't scare easy." The woman's eyes fluttered open, filled with pain but also something else, hope. "Why?" she asked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Why would you do this?" Silas didn't answer right away. He looked at Maeve, then at the woman, then at the broken window where the wind whistled through like a ghost. "Because someone has to," he said finally. "And because no child should have to stand alone in the cold while the world tries to break her." He stood, walked to the corner where a rusty rifle leaned against the wall, and picked it up. Then he turned to Maeve. "Go outside. Stay close to the horses. If you hear shouting, run. Don't look back." Maeve nodded, her small face set with determination. As she slipped out the door, Silas turned to the woman. "You rest," he said. "I'll handle the rest." And then he walked to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. 3 riders were coming. Dust kicked up behind them like a funeral shroud. He didn't reach for his pistol. Didn't raise his rifle. Just stood there, still as stone, waiting. Because he knew something they didn't. When a giant decides to protect the weak, the world better step aside, or get crushed beneath his boots. The riders came at dusk, their silhouettes cutting sharp against the blood-orange sky like knives drawn from sheaths. 3 men, Clayton Briggs, the bank's foreman with a silver star pinned crooked on his vest, his brother Jed, a brute with knuckles scarred from bar fights, and a hired gun named Pike, eyes dead as river stones, fingers never far from his revolver. They reined in at the edge of the clearing, boots crunching on frozen earth, spurs jingling like death chimes. "Rourke," Briggs bellowed, voice cracking with false authority. "You got no claim here. That woman owes the bank $200. She can't pay, she forfeits the land, and the child." Silas stood in the doorway of the Miller shack, arms crossed, shoulders squared, his massive frame blocking the entire entrance like a living wall. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't draw his weapon. Just stared at them, his eyes dark as storm clouds. "She's sick," he said, voice low but carrying like thunder over plains. "And the girl's 6 years old. You really think God's gonna let you take them in this cold?" Briggs spat into the snow. "God don't run this territory. The bank does." Behind him, Jed chuckled, cracking his knuckles. "We ain't here to debate scripture, Rourke. We're here to collect." Silas took one step forward, just one, but it was enough to make Pike's hand twitch toward his gun. "You touch that trigger," Silas said, "and I'll break your arm before the bullet leaves the chamber." Silence fell, thick and heavy. Then Maeve's voice cut through it, small, clear, unwavering. She stood beside Silas now, clutching her mother's shawl, her eyes blazing. "Mama didn't steal nothing. She worked the land till she couldn't stand. You took her husband in a mine collapse, and now you want her bones too." The words hung in the air like a curse. Briggs shifted uncomfortably. Even Jed looked away. But Pike just sneered. "Cute kid. Shame she'll end up in an orphanage." That was the last straw. Silas moved, not with rage, but with terrifying calm. He stepped down from the porch, his boots thudding like war drums. "You listen good," he said, voice dropping to a growl that made the horses snort in fear. "This land ain't yours. That woman ain't yours. And that child, she's under my protection now. You come near her again, and I won't just break your bones. I'll bury you so deep, your ghosts won't find their way back." He didn't threaten violence. He stated fact. And in that moment, the 3 men saw not a rancher, but a force of nature. Briggs tried to bluff. "You think you're above the law." Silas almost smiled. "Law's what you make it out here. And right now, my word is the only law that matters." He turned his back on them, a move so bold it stole their breath, and walked back to Maeve, placing a massive hand on her shoulder. "Go inside," he murmured. "Your mom is waiting." As the girl disappeared into the shack, Silas turned once more to the riders. "Leave, now, and if I see your faces near Blackridge again, I won't warn you twice." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Briggs nodded. "This ain't over, Rourke." "It is for you," Silas replied. And with that, the 3 riders turned their horses and vanished into the gathering night, their shadows swallowed by the pines. Inside, Maeve knelt beside her mother, who was crying softly, not from fear, but from relief. Silas stood in the doorway, watching the firelight dance on their faces, and for the first time in years, he felt something he'd forgotten: purpose. Winter deepened its grip on the land, burying the world in snow and silence. But inside the Miller shack, now patched, reinforced, and warmed by a stone hearth built by Silas's own hands, life began to bloom again. He didn't move them to his ranch. Didn't force them into his world. Instead, he rebuilt theirs, plank by plank, beam by beam, as if proving that dignity wasn't given, it was restored. By day, he chopped wood, hauled water from the frozen creek, and hunted elk to fill their smokehouse. By night, he sat by the fire, mending fences with thick rope, listening as Maeve read aloud from a tattered schoolbook she'd found in the attic, her voice growing stronger with every page. Her mother, Eleanor O'Donnell, began to heal, not fully, not quickly, but enough. The cough lessened, the color returned to her cheeks. And one evening, as Silas handed her a bowl of venison stew, she looked up at him with eyes clear for the first time in months. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You don't owe us anything." Silas stirred the fire with a poker, sparks rising like fireflies. "I saw a child standing alone in the cold," he said. "And I remembered, I was once that child." He rarely spoke of his past, but that night, he shared a sliver of it: how his parents died in a cholera outbreak when he was 7, how he'd wandered the plains for weeks before a trapper took him in, how he'd sworn that no one under his watch would ever feel that kind of abandonment again. Eleanor reached out, not to touch him, but to place her hand near his on the hearthstone. "You've given us more than shelter," she said. "You've given us back our names." Word of what happened spread through the territory, not as gossip, but as legend. They called him the guardian of Blackridge. Some said he'd single-handedly scared off a gang of outlaws. Others claimed he'd carried the sick woman on his back through a blizzard. But the truth was simpler, and far more powerful: he'd chosen to stand when no one else would. And that choice rippled outward. Trappers began leaving extra pelts on the porch. A widow from the next valley brought seeds for the spring garden. Even the local preacher, who'd once called Silas a brute without soul, sent a basket of dried apples with a note: "God works through hands like yours." But the real test came when Briggs returned, not with guns, but with papers. He stood at the edge of the property, hat in hand, voice stripped of arrogance. "The bank, they're calling in all debts. But I spoke to the board. Told them what you did. They agreed, the O'Donnells are clear. No more payments. Land's theirs." Silas didn't thank him, just nodded. "Good." And as Briggs turned to leave, Silas added, "Tell your men, if they ever need work, Blackridge always hires honest hands." It wasn't forgiveness. It was something better, a chance to be better. Spring came late that year, but when it did, it burst forth like a promise kept. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth. Birds returned to the pines. And in the newly tilled garden behind the shack, Maeve planted seeds with hands that no longer trembled. She was taller now, her voice steadier, her laughter louder. She called Silas Uncle Bearclaw, not out of obligation, but affection. He never corrected her, never claimed her as his own. But he was there, for every scraped knee, every nightmare, every question about the stars. Eleanor, though still frail, walked without help now, her strength returning like a slow river. She began teaching at the one-room schoolhouse in the next valley, her lessons filled with poetry and kindness. And Silas, he still ran Blackridge, still rode the range, still carried the weight of 100 responsibilities. But now, every evening, he rode 2 miles east, to a cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, a girl waving from the porch, and a woman who set an extra plate at the table, just in case. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch shelling peas, Maeve looked up at him, her eyes serious beyond her years. "Are you ever gonna leave?" Silas paused, then shook his head. "Not while you need me." She thought for a moment, then smiled. "Then I guess I'll always need you." He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that startled a flock of crows from the trees. And in that laugh, the ghosts of his past finally found peace. Years later, travelers would pass through the valley and ask about the giant rancher who lived alone on the ridge. But the locals would smile and point east. "He's not alone," they'd say. "He's got a family. Not the kind you're born into, the kind you choose." And on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, you could still hear the echo of a little girl's voice in the pines, no longer pleading, but proud. He's big. Bigger than anyone. And he doesn't scare easy. Because in the end, it wasn't strength that saved them. It was the choice to stand, together. In a world where weakness meant death, one giant chose to protect the fragile, and in doing so, rebuilt not just a home, but a legacy of courage, compassion, and quiet, unshakable love.